Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third program of TBI at 90. My name is Gary Tepfer. Together with my fellow committee members Emily Heilbrunn and Ellen Todres, we have worked with Rabbi Ruhi Sophia Motzkin-Rubenstein to look back and examine our community, to celebrate and honor our strengths, to examine our past, and to look to our future. The focus this afternoon, the focus of our program today is honoring and welcoming interfaith members. We will look at how interfaith policies evolved at TBI as our community has evolved and grown. Before we start, I would like to especially thank Naama Tubman for all of her excellent energy and work that she's put into our program today. Unfortunately, she cannot be here today. Thanks also to our panelists, to Rabbi Ruhi Sophia, and to all of you for being here. Rabbi Ruhi Sophia will now introduce our topic and the panelists and will moderate our discussion. We hope that there will be time to allow for questions and comments, and please keep these brief and to the point. Rabbi?
Good afternoon, friends. It's good to be here with all of you and with this wonderful panel of people.
It's a little hard to hear you. Yep, working on it.
All right. June is going to work on that, but keep giving feedback if you need it. So I'm going to just say to my friends on this panel, you're going to need to sort of eat the microphone. They'll be okay as long as we eat the microphone. So the question of how we engage as a Jewish community that has people who are not Jewish as part of it is a question that has existed for thousands of years. There are tractates of the Talmud, Tractate Avodah Zarah, Tractate Horayot, that are devoted to the question of what it means to live by Jewish law in a pluralistic society. And some of our favorite Bible stories have to do with characters navigating interfaith life. Moshe marrying a woman who is Midianite. The story of Ruth, who is the foremother of our Messiah, our tradition teaches, is a Moabite who marries into the faith. And so the history of interfaith involvement at Temple Beth Israel has to be understood in the context of the history of interfaith involvement of the Jewish people. That is also not just about how do we welcome or not people who are not Jewish into our community, but also the question of who is a Jew, especially when a Jewish person and someone who is not Jewish get married and make a baby together, then the interfaith question also becomes a Jewish status question. And I mention that in part because part of the evolution of Temple Beth Israel's approach to interfaith questions has to do with the evolution of Temple Beth Israel's affiliation with movements that answer that question differently. So a few thousand years ago, we could say, the Jewish mainstream consensus became the consensus that a Jew is someone who has a Jewish mother, was born coming out of a Jewish womb, or someone who converted to Judaism under recognized auspices. And that was the consensus, for better, for worse, in many ways, for thousands of years throughout diaspora Jewish communities. Although we can see in biblical stories that back in the times of the Bible, that had actually not been necessarily the consensus. And then in 1973, which you can see, I believe, on the timeline we handed out, there was a watershed moment when the Reform movement, it doesn't say that on your timeline, but the Reform movement in the United States published a responsa defining as a Jew anyone who has a Jewish parent and meaningful, timely, and public acts of Jewish identification, which becomes an extremely confusing, possibly subjective definition, and has made the question of who is a Jew, who is interfaith, what is a Jewish family, what is an interfaith family, all the more, I would say, fascinating, to use a term that isn't loaded, in the subsequent 50 years since then. And I mention that as an important watershed point because for 60-some years of history, Temple Beth Israel was affiliated with the conservative movement, which continued to define a Jew by the fairly dry definition of anyone who was born of a Jewish mother or converted under conservative, orthodox, mainstream auspices. And in the mid-90s, when TBI affiliated Reconstructionist, one of the things that changed with that change in affiliation is that the Reconstructionist position follows the Reform 1973 responsa. So we consider a Jew anyone who was born of a Jewish parent with meaningful, timely, and public acts of Jewish identification, which means as rabbi, I sometimes have conversations with people where we're trying to figure out together, well, so would you say you are a Jew? Or do you feel like you might need something that affirms your Judaism more? So I just give this backstory because it is an ongoing dynamic question and challenge for a community to be interfaith, to be welcoming of interfaith individuals, interfaith households, as well as welcoming of Jews whose Jewish identity is not necessarily the same thing as what other people might think when they think Jewish identity. And at the same time, to hold certain boundaries that may be shifting, because it is true that some people are not Jewish, and that one doesn't become Jewish just by saying, well, I feel Jewish today, so now I'm Jewish, right? We actually have lines, and we have a, so to speak, naturalization process for those who wish to identify with this people. So even the term interfaith is also an ambiguous term because it's used rather interchangeably to describe households and sometimes individuals where there is a Jewish influence and a non-Jewish influence that is nonetheless fairly neutral. But also it can be used to describe a household or a person where there is a Jewish influence as well as an influence that is quite actively of another faith. And so that becomes one of the questions we discuss when discussing interfaith. Now, with all of that, TBI is unique not only in our historical change in affiliation, but that back in the 90s, before that change in affiliation, we had a rabbi, Rabbi Myron Kinberg, who really did pioneering work in welcoming interfaith families. He innovated the Ger Toshav, literally the other among us document that he used when performing intermarriages, where someone who was not Jewish and did not intend to convert to Judaism could sign on to be all in with the Jewish people and raising a Jewish family while respectfully holding themselves in a different identity. And so TBI's approach to this continues to evolve, as we have been talking about in our 90 years, and to explore how are we doing this, who are we leaving out, who are we bringing in, what are the challenges and costs, and always, what could we be doing better? Now with that, I want to introduce our panelists who have such a wonderful array of interfaith experiences to bring to this community. And I'm not going to read out their introductions because in the handout we've handed out, you actually have their bios, but I will say Raisa Maddox has been a part of Interfaith TBI from before the moment of her birth. Craig Starr and his wife Sandy Sheets have been extremely active contributors to the Temple Beth Israel community since the time that they moved here in the mid-90s, active contributors to the TBI community at large as well as to the Interfaith Chavurah. Daniel Hogan and his wife Megan moved here in 2018? 2019. January 2019, right. They were here a year before the pandemic hit, and have also been instrumental in sort of reviving the new generation of interfaith committee, interfaith inreach and outreach within our community. And Doug Currier is an interfaith spouse of an interfaith household that has had its own wrestling with the who is a Jew question, which we may or may not get to on this panel today. So I'm so delighted to be here with all of you, and I wanted to invite each of you to start just with speaking for up to 4 minutes each around the question of why are you on this panel? What in your own Jewish identity, family history, and current family configuration makes the question of interfaith engagement particularly relevant to your life? So we're going to take it in sort of chronological order of TBI engagement and start with our current Vice President of TBI, Raisa Maddox.
Thank you. This was carefully timed yesterday. I'm hoping not to overstay my welcome on this one. I grew up in a Jewish household where religion was always a part of our family conversation. My father is a very religious Christian, and my mother was very involved in the Jewish community. We were always at synagogue and often at church. My parents were in total agreement that our Jewish religious education would extend as far as it could within our community, including what was provided at home. My family's spiritual and social needs were met at TBI. My parents' desire for political action and my father's spiritual needs were met at his church. My parents moved far away from their families because my father found a job where he did, but also because they felt it would be easier for them to raise their children away from the pressures and expectations of their extended family. Visits to beloved grandparents always involved a morning in church, attending Sunday school, which had familiar stories with very different spins on them. Dietary rules were explained and re-explained, and it was bewildering when none of my father's family attended my bat mitzvah because they honestly did not know what to do with such an invitation. In the 70s and 80s, when I grew up, there was a belief that one of the greatest threats to Judaism was interfaith marriage. My peers at TBI mentioned more than once they would never marry outside of Judaism because it would mean the end of Jews as we knew them. This continued to be true in my experience with Young Judea conventions, that was the active youth group at the time, where the students in Portland, Seattle, and Bellingham very much embraced that feeling as well, that interfaith marriage would be the end of all of us. And it was a regular topic of conventions that it was treated as a threat, it was treated as a problem. What do we do about interfaith marriage? How do we keep it from happening, diluting who we are and what we bring to the world? It never occurred to me that I would marry a Jewish person. My experience of people my age who grow up in 100% Jewish families hasn't been particularly welcoming, and I have not typically felt comfortable in primarily Jewish spaces. My household is far less religious than that of my parents. Those of you who know them would know that almost every household is less religious in some ways. As our daughter grew up at TBI, and that's because my husband is agnostic, so I'm from both kinds of interfaith families, the kind with two faiths and the kind with one very strong faith. As our daughter grew up at TBI, it soon became clear that the population of TBI had shifted dramatically, as had the general, at least in Eugene, philosophy toward interfaith households. At least half of Sylvie's B'nai Mitzvah class were from interfaith households. Some of these parents too joined while doubting that they would be welcome. They didn't realize that because our 50% of interfaith households have been pretty invisible, I think. And so I asked Sylvie what her experience had been growing up here, if she felt like her peers at TBI considered her to be half Jewish, less Jewish than they were. And her response was that she's never felt that way at TBI, but when she goes to BBYO conventions, when she goes to Israel, when she goes everywhere else in the Juniverse, she very much feels that she's perceived as less of a Jewish person. While it's comforting to consider that TBI has come a long way in the time between my generation and that of my daughter, I am keenly aware that we could be doing more as an institution. It would be easier to pat ourselves on the back and consider this a job well done because we truly have made a lot of progress. I think it would serve our community better for us all, myself very much included, to question why interfaith families still don't feel consistently held, appreciated, and part of our community.
Thank you so much, Raisa, and well done. That was exactly 4 minutes.
My parents were both Jewish. They were first generation American born, so I believe assimilation was probably a top priority for them. We belonged to Temple Beth Israel, the Reform congregation in San Diego. We're not particularly observant family. We did not keep kosher, did not do Shabbos dinner. We went to services on occasional Friday nights. And my parents even had put up a Christmas tree in December. And in later years, I asked my mother, well, why did you do that? And she said, well, we thought you kids would enjoy it. Notwithstanding that, I believe I developed a very strong Jewish identity for a number of reasons. I was not, and to this day, I don't consider myself particularly spiritual or very observant, but I was at an early age caught by the intellectual aspects of Judaism and the values and the connections between Torah text and contemporary issues. The rabbi at that synagogue, as we are blessed with now, was very good at making those connections. And I used to just sit there as a youngster in awe of how he could do that and how you do it, Rabbi. Exegesis has always been of interest to me. And in fact, in my college years, I was very interested in comparative religions. I felt no question about my identity and felt very strongly that I should be a part of the Jewish community and should be a supportive member of the Jewish community going forward in my adult life. Nonetheless, I did not marry within the faith, but I was lucky and fortunate to marry a lovely, strong woman who was very supportive of the Jewish community and our participation in that community. And in particular, we decided, even before we got married, first of all, that the children needed to be raised in one religion, that having two religions in the household was not going to work and did not make sense and was really beyond the capacity of children to sort out and not fair to them. And since I was the one who felt most strongly about it, we agreed to raise the children as Jews. Sandy's religion is very personal to her. One time I took her to Christmas Mass, and she afterwards asked, why did we do that? I wasn't interested in it. And I said, well, I was, because I was still interested in comparative religion. She has never expressed to me any feelings that she hasn't had the freedom to be herself. But her religion is very personal to her, and so we've not had any kind of confusion within the household. When we moved to Eugene, we did join the Interfaith Havurah because we were invited, and it was a great social opportunity. But I think the focus was more on how do we answer questions for our children in a non-Jewish society, a society that's really dominated by a non-Jewish narrative, more so than any real particular conflicts within the house or confusions of over identity.
Thank you, Craig. And just again, this is Daniel Hogan.
Hi there. Daniel Hogan. I'm a pretty newcomer to Oregon in general. I grew up in the Kansas City area. My parents, I also came from an interfaith household. My father was where the name Hogan comes from. My father's side, Irish Catholic. He grew up in St. Louis, and his grandfather was the first person to come over from Ireland, the first generation living in the United States. On my mother's side, it was almost the exact same timing, but it was on her side, the family, much like Fiddler on the Roof, they came from Rafalovka, Ukraine, up in the northwest, and they were very Orthodox. I'm not even sure if there were any other flavors of Judaism at the time when they came to the United States. My mother and my father got together, and they got married in 1983, and it was one of the very few interfaith marriages at that time in Kansas City. There's only one synagogue and one rabbi at the time that was willing to do it, the New Reform Synagogue out there, and they had their own issues being interfaith, but we were always in a community where there was only maybe 2 or 3. Like the Jewish community in Kansas City was a big community, but the parts of Kansas City we lived in, the parts of Kansas City we traded in, there were very, 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 very few Jews that were involved in the things that we're doing on a regular basis. So it didn't really ever feel like you're a misfit. You go to a school, though, in a school district, there's the whole school district's, I'm in a graduating class of 200 people, and the whole school district's probably 6,000 to 7,000 people. There's like 3 Jewish families in a whole school district. But you drive 3 miles, you cross a state line, which is 3 miles away from where we lived, and there are school districts there that have the bulk of the Jews in the community. They may have 400 or 500 Jewish students, and it was an interesting time and an interesting place to live in. I had a bar mitzvah, and after that, what does Judaism mean to me? My family asked me, do you want to go on and do confirmation? At the time, I was having a real difficult time getting along with my peers at the synagogue. We had completely different relationship to the things that we did on a daily basis. We just had different lives, and I struggled with that, and I said, if it means I have to be in classroom for another 3 years with these knuckleheads, I want nothing to do with it. There's more important things in life than sitting there and trying to prove to some people I can barely stand that, hey, I'm Jewish enough to be part of you. So I didn't really think about it much. We'd go to Friday night services periodically, and went off to college and fell in love with somebody. We ended up getting married, and I went back we didn't know, she was Southern Baptist, and I grew up Jewish. I didn't feel like Christ compelled me to do anything, didn't really want to go into that direction, and she knows how hard it is to become Jewish, and didn't want to try to even think about conversion. This is, 14 years ago? And I hooked up with the cantor that performed my bar mitzvah and said, hey, would you be interested in doing an interfaith marriage with, a Southern Baptist and me? And he goes, yeah, I know just the Baptist minister I want to do it with too. And we found an interfaith chapel in a state-run botanical garden. We got married. A few years later, I had moved up to my family. We moved up to northwest Iowa, Sioux City, Iowa, where Nebraska and South Dakota and Iowa all touch. A lot of people didn't know that that's the case. You're in the middle of nowhere out there. We're in a very, very tiny congregation, and I got an opportunity to do the work that I do. I'm an air traffic controller. I got an opportunity to be an air traffic controller here in Eugene, and I said, Pacific Northwest sounds beautiful. My wife was always wanted to live up here, and we came here, and one thing led to another, and we joined this community. Never in my wildest imagination would I think that I'd be sitting on a panel telling anybody anything about my experience being interfaith and representing my family. Megan would have been here tonight, except our oldest, she made finals at a regional swim meet that's at Willamette Lane right now. So, thank you.
All right, well, hi, everyone. Definitely hearing a lot that resonates with me. I'm Doug Courier again, and we've been in Eugene 12 years, and my wife Lizzie here in the crowd is has converted to Judaism in August 2023, so not too long ago, but has taught at Talmud Torah with some of y'all's kids, and so, but really, I think for me the Shabbat ritual and week to week traditions that we came upon during the pandemic. I think it was February or March 2020 when Lizzie started studying towards her conversion. Really kind of became radical in a way, especially during the pandemic where everything was kind of the same thing, day in and day out. So this was dedicated time for us to, stop and, have that time. And so Interfaith, it's an interesting way of looking at it, Jewish, non-Jewish. I was raised Southern Baptist in Florida, so, but had left that, long ago. But, there's sort of like a societal kind of microcosm when you're thinking, at least for me, when you're thinking about interfaith, it's like, how do we get along, not only within our house, but in the world. So I consider our house to be a Jewish household, and I'm doing what I need to do to kind of support, making that happen. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else to add to that. I'm just really grateful to be invited to join this panel. Have always felt pretty welcome coming into TBI, thankfully, because I know I could see how much converting to Judaism has meant to Lizzie, and being part of the Talmud Torah, and I don't know. It's just it's been a very positive experience, and so thinking of circumstances where that wouldn't be the case is yeah, it's I don't know, in some ways feeling lucky, that folks are willing to kind of make it so that can happen, but I know that it doesn't happen easily. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you also, Daniel, Craig, and Reza. I'm going to ask 3 follow-up questions for the panel, just so you all know what's going to happen. Then we're going to open some time. I'm looking around the room, and I know that there are many people here who have some sort of interfaith relationship within the TBI milieu. So I'd love to open it up a little bit for you to come to that microphone and share any memories, anecdotes about your own joys and struggles with interfaith at TBI, as well as questions you might have for the panelists. But first, since we did get them up here, I'd like to invite them to share. I mean, this is a little bit what you led with, but if there's a particular experience or memory that really relates to the joys and or the challenges of being part of an interfaith household that you'd be willing to share. And we don't have to go in order. Oh, Doug, your time is up.
Well, I don't mind starting. The problem with me starting is I sometimes don't stop. In the relationship with my family and my wife's family, one of the things that you talk about a memory, and I remember this one time. My wife, she's Southern Baptist, but her grandparents on her father's side are Assembly of God, and they're in eastern Iowa. And the whole notion of explaining to them for the very first time, right? And wasn't the first time, the second time, third time, fourth time, but it was this recurring thing for like 6 months that, Megan's not marrying a Christian, she's marrying a Jewish guy. And they immediately, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. We've met lots of Messianic Jews. And they just could not, we found a real struggle with explaining this to people that, in southeast Iowa, there are synagogues, I don't mean to do the air quotation, but this messianic thing, I never really encountered it much. I was kind of familiar with the concept, but it was kind of a big deal out there, and they just wouldn't accept that I wasn't that. That was a little bit tough, and eventually, eventually, it just lots of dialoguing and trying not to be, rude to my folk, rude to her folks. But that's trying, and occasionally, from time to time, something will creep up. Somebody will give us a gift from that side of the family, and it will have some of this messianic Jew, symbology on it, and what they think. Oh, we're relating to you. It's so good that we're all Abrahamic faith, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, I appreciate this, but at some point you just don't want to explain it anymore, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure if I got at the heart of your question on that, but it is certainly a memory that comes up from time to time. Hopefully somebody's got a better story to tell.
That was a pretty good story, Daniel, honestly. May I go? You may. I would say many interfaith households could talk for a very long time about the perilous time of year that is Christmas with extended families. And I mean, we all end up working it out, right, in whatever way that we do.
And there's a reason we scheduled this for now.
Right. Because it's hard, and it's hard. And I definitely, one of my tough memories is listening to my husband scream at his father on the phone while we drove down West 11th about, fine, Dad, we're not coming to Christmas at all this year if you can't just tell her that there really is no Santa and you lied. Like, there was a whole thing. So that was a difficult memory, which, maybe we handled it well, maybe we handled it poorly, but we handled it. And I will say that the sweetest memory that I have was all of my father's relatives coming to Sylvie's bat mitzvah. Every single living one.
As I tried to intimate with my opening remarks, the focus of interfaith issues for us has been on our children and raising our children, both to be fully Jewish within the Jewish community, and also to navigate a world that isn't. And so I think the greatest memory I have is that we were successful. Our children, in their own very personal ways, very strongly Jewish, have a very strong identity. And so Daniel, you reminded me, I had almost exactly the same experience. My wife comes from a German Lutheran community in South Dakota. And her mother, in particular, I suspect her father was somewhat devout, but he was more quiet about it. His mother, her mother, while she accepted me as a son-in-law, was constantly sending in the mail little tracts from the New Testament and in prayers, for me, invoking Jesus' protection. And at one time I took her aside and I said, Mom, I'm really very happy being a Jew, and why is it you keep trying to push your religion off on me? And she said, well, I just want us all to be together in the afterlife. And I said, oh, in that case you can relax, because the Jewish heaven is ecumenical. So she I tell that long story because it's important to how I know how strong a kid's Jewish identity is, that they were very resistant to all that. And in fact, one time, Mom was out to visit at Christmas, and I think it was Josh, who was, Sandy will remember how old he was then, but he was pretty little, and he came in and says, Grandma said the J word. Not Jewish, Jesus. And so he knew who he was, and even at that young age, and it's persisted. So That's wonderful. I have opportunities later to talk. I mean, I recognize that everything is not hunky-dory. There are issues to deal with, and I have made notes on what some of those are, but I'm going to wait for other questions, chance to talk about them.
Yeah, I guess keeping with the Christmas theme, there's such a large amount of cultural touch points, for both Lizzie and I, growing up with Christmas, and then, jettisoning those, and yeah, there's a period of adjustment, right? So it's especially with family, extended family, saying, we're not doing this anymore, and making a conscious choice to make that, that change. And so I think there were some moments of pain there, but also, necessary, to make sure that, we weren't doing both, I guess, because we're not. So I think there's a bit of pain and joy with that for us. And I think, I can imagine it being painful, for a family too. You're just like, oh, there was this connection, or this, you were this place in my mental mind or mental map, and now you're not. And that being, hard for people. But, just one more thing is just this idea of not being society is not a monolith. And so, this time of year especially, it seems like it is, because you're out there in town, and it's just very much one thing. And, having the reminder that that's not true, that's not reality, has been, a particularly profound kind of experience for me.
Thank you all. And as I said to Race, although I don't know that the microphone didn't pick it up, it was not by accident that we chose to have our TBI at 90 event focusing on interfaith issues this particular season, because I know that this particular season is challenging, probably for all Jewish households, and particularly for households that are navigating interfaith relationships close in. It does strike me that all of you answered this question by speaking to the challenges sort of imposed by the external culture, the non-Jewish family members. And I want to invite you to challenge the TBI community internally a little more with our next question. Jews sometimes don't make it easy for Jewish interfaith households. And you certainly don't all have to answer this, but I know there are specific ways that, and sometimes surprising, sometimes really jarring ways, that people coming from interfaith households can experience themselves as being othered. Raisa, you already spoke to this a little bit about in your own upbringing, but I'm wondering if you or any of you would like to share more about moments that were hard within the Jewish community, moments that felt like belonging was in question.
I think you missed this piece of the planning meeting, and so I'm going to be really careful about my time, because when I get on this particular topic, I can go off to the races. And I do think that we as Jews are extremely talented gatekeepers, right? We gatekeep everything. We're like, yeah, that bagel, it's not as good as my bagel. My bagel's, the Chicago bagel is the only real bagel, people, So we're really good at it in ways that are kind of humorous and funny. Okay, New York, she says. Okay. There are ways that are humorous and funny, and I will say this, I really do not like the term half-Jewish. And I will try to restrain myself from talking about all the different ways that I don't like this term. But because poor Gary, his hair was like whipped back by the time I was done talking at our planning meeting. And he actually hadn't even said the term. I would invite the Jewish community, including the TBI community, to consider what it would take for a child of an interfaith marriage to become fully Jewish if they're half Jewish. And because we all already know the answer to the question, I would ask you to not use that term anymore.
I don't know if my life has just been boring or I've gone through it with my eyes closed, but I can honestly sit here and say that I have never felt excluded or questioned or challenged because of my interfaith marriage. I don't think my kids have either. They've certainly never come and related any such episodes. Neither has my wife ever really complained about feelings of being excluded. That's not to say that things have not happened that put a spotlight on issues that yes, need attention paid, but I've never felt anybody being particularly malicious or intentionally trying to exclude me or any member of my family. So I'll share with you one of the strongest examples that did not actually happen in this community. Our son was bar mitzvah at the Reformed Synagogue in Oakland, California, from which we moved in 1995. But at the time we moved, he had just come up to the point of his bar mitzvah. His community was still there. Ours was still there. We hadn't formed a new community here. So we went back there and to finish his studies and have his bar mitzvah. And in a planning session with the rabbi there, she said to Sandy and me, Josh needs to go through a conversion process. And I said, well, if you think he's not Jewish, you're going to have to tell him. And that was the end of that. It went no further than that. She may well have been thinking about whether he might have to at some point face that question of other Jews considering him less than Jewish. But she didn't articulate it, so I don't know. I'm just trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Other issues, so at some point here at TBI, somebody said, we're letting non-Jewish spouses vote. They're not members, they can't vote. The board worked on that. There was kind of when I was on the board, it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy about that. And nobody ever asked to see an ID card before a hand was raised at a community, a congregational meeting. I know that there were families in the Interfaith Chavurah who were there because they did not feel that they were welcome in the TBI community. They'd had unfortunate experiences, but these were very personal to them. So I suspect things, do happen. Ritual limitations also, can the interfaith spouse participate in passing the Torah down to the bar mitzvah? Can they be called up for an aliyah? These are all things. Within our family, these were not issues because I believe Sandy, first of all, had no interest in intruding in, pushing herself into a situation where you've got to let me have an aliyah. She understood, their limitations. If you're going to have a Jewish identity, there are going to be some limitations. And dealing with those limitations is really probably the central facet of what we're talking about here. But, none of these things that I have experienced have I felt were, as I said, there was no ill intent behind them. They're just dealing with the realities of life that we're all, that we have, there have to be some limitations. And of course our wedding. I neglected to mention our wedding. The difficulty of finding a rabbi who would marry us, even though At that point, he's no longer, rabbi, I'm not going to mention the name. I had a cousin who was a rabbi of blessed memory, and he was very active in the ecumenical circles, and I felt sure if I asked him he would marry us. No, he would not. We've wound up getting married by a vice president at Sutro and Company, a stockbroker who had been a rabbi, and he retired to be a stockbroker. So, and he married us in our backyard under a chuppah. But so those are I've had. I just wanted to make clear. I've had experiences with where the lines are, but I've been also very fortunate in life. I've never felt like anybody was being mean-spirited about it.
I don't want to take time away from either one of you, but I have other things to say. Would you go first and then I'll go after you?
I'll be really quick.
Sure.
Yeah.
Take your time.
So, Craig, I'm glad you're mentioning the term limitations. I adore limitations, and so, but I can imagine without that personal kind of respect that one might have, others might not, and so there is that difficult thing to navigate if there's not that self kind of censorship or self kind of just respect, I guess, and not wanting to insert or assert. Really quickly, I think we're pretty new to this, so we haven't experienced that, to my knowledge, at least personally. Haven't experienced these sort of acts of exclusion, thankfully. But it's almost like I'm preparing myself for them, because I do think they are somewhat easily found. Again, I haven't experienced that at all here, but I'm just acknowledging that they're easily found. That's it.
I think it's really important to consider that people can be very hurtful without having a malicious intent. If you've read my bio, one of the things that is in Maddox family lore is that my parents, when they moved here in 1966, they knew someone who knew Florence Nyman, may her memory be for a blessing, because she was a real pip. She was the best. And my mother's friend, Joan Pearson, called up Florence and said, there's this nice couple that's moved to town, and I know it's a little weird, but he belongs to our church, and she's Jewish, but she's legit. Tell Lou, may his memory be for a blessing, that she's very sensible, and she really is Jewish, and tell Lou to give her a chance. And so my mother, who was very young at the time, went scared to death to services in 1966, and because he knew that she had the Joan Pearson stamp of approval, he gave her a chance. And because he gave her a chance, she felt very grateful and worked very hard to show her gratitude by building community. And I don't think there was any malice involved. I mean, I think that they rightly or wrongly, I think there was a perception in the Jewish community that these couples were flaky and they were the end of the world. I don't think that they disliked her. I think they were just frightened of what was coming next. And so there's that. And then the other thing that I would say, and this is a story I really waffled about telling because it casts a wonderful person in a not wonderful light, but he was a wonderful person. When Rabbi Myron Kinberg was really thinking about what was ethical for him to do in terms of marrying interfaith couples, he asked me to come to his office and he talked to me about whether or not I considered myself to be a Jew. And I was 12, 13. Yitzhak might know more about what year that would have been. But it was actually a terrible experience because I thought I was. And again, there's no malice. But what are you doing? What messages are you sending to people really when you think you're doing the right thing and being careful.
Yeah, and I just want to, I probably should have prefaced my remarks by saying this. I feel very fortunate in feeling the way I do, and I'm not going to move off of that, but it's, I also don't question when other people tell me they've had very negative experiences. And as I said, I've heard of some very negative experiences over the years. You know, people being very unhappy about things. But I was asked to talk here about me, so I thought I'd just give you my perspective. That I'm, you know, I feel very fortunate and very grateful the way I've been treated, both by, notwithstanding the story I told on the rabbi in Oakland. That community was great. It was very much like TBI, about the same size. It was reform, but otherwise it was kind of a Hamish place, very musical. Both communities have been wonderful for us, but again, please don't take my remarks as suggesting that that we should not value what other people are telling you about has been their experiences.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. When we first came to this community, we had a rough go trying to get hooked up with the synagogue or a synagogue or get involved in the Jewish community. And I guarantee, especially at the time, that I have always had this, you know, having a last name Hogan and walking into a place in a synagogue and you introduce yourself as, yeah, I'm Jewish, I'm Daniel Hogan, nice to meet you. And the looks people give you. Hogan? Well, that's not very Jewish. Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, so I had this whole life experience of you walk in a synagogue, you introduce yourself, people are kind of warm at the beginning, and then they get real weird, so you walk in here, you start having some issues right off the bat. There are a handful of families that were fantastic. Unfortunately, I don't remember the people that we originally met, but we hooked up with Nama accidentally on a Friday night service, and that ended up being fantastic for us, another interfaith family. But the struggles that we had, I guarantee you that I thought that this was, it's because we're interfaith, because I got a last name Hogan, my wife is Southern Baptist, we're getting side-eye for that. I've been here now 5 years, and one of the things that I realized after living in Eugene, Oregon, I don't know how many people are not from the Pacific Northwest or are not from the West Coast here, but you know, the joke about the Seattle freeze, this isn't TBI, this is the community in general. I call it the Eugene, Oregon stranger danger. I mean, there's full-blown adults that are scared to death to talk to anybody for any reason under any circumstance unless they really know them, but they won't do anything to get to know them. And then this really crazy thing happens after living here, at least my experience, my whole family's experience, and I'm an air traffic controller. 90% of people I work with, I got 22 employees working for me, 90% of them are not from here, and most of them have only been here 2 or 3 years. They have the exact same experience. Something magical happens. You've been in the community 24 months. It's like your tree. People are used to walking by that tree all the time. All of a sudden, they'll start talking to you, and then it's not a problem anymore. What I did find, there was a period of time, this is probably at the time COVID was getting real scary. We were struggling to get to know the community. We were struggling to find people, especially in the Jewish community. Do we even want to bother raising our kids Jewish? Somebody that was a former rabbi in this synagogue that's no longer a rabbi in this synagogue even told us point blank, you're not going to, you know, your kids aren't Jewish because Megan's not Jewish. So I'll teach them, we can get them involved, but they have to convert, right? This is stuff that I'd never, ever encountered. I placed a phone call, no, I wrote an email, and I was shocked to get an email back saying, you know, I've just had it with this community. All you ever do is membership, money, you know, it's everybody seems cold. And I just wrote an email back saying, I don't like this. We've had some bad experiences. Maybe we're just going to be done with the synagogue. And I was astounded that the front office reached out and it put me in contact. I started having direct conversations with Ruhi and the receptiveness and we need to talk about what's going on. And maybe your perspective and your experiences are legit. Maybe there's reasons that your perspective, you're seeing the things you're seeing, but you're interpreting them wrong potentially. Let's talk about that. And it was a 180-degree turn from every experience that I've had in every synagogue that I've been to in all the different places. Not granted, most of them in the Midwest, not the Pacific Northwest, different world, different culture altogether. But just reaching out and have somebody come back and say, yeah, I'll talk to you. Let's talk. This is not how we see ourselves. We don't want to see ourselves this way. We don't want to behave that way. And there's maybe more to the story. You're not getting the whole thing. And that was a very, very, very big and powerful and important thing to me. I'm not sure it's specific to being interfaith, but it is experience of somebody brand new in a community coming to the synagogue. So there's that.
Thank you all for sharing. And, well, Daniel, you're being too gentle, I think, with me. I mean, part of the complaint was feeling neglected by the rabbi, and I think it's worth naming that. And the ways that, the community leaders, whether that's me, whether that's our executive director, other people in positions of power in the community, even by omission, right? Even if I'm walking down the street and I don't recognize you, so I don't say hi, the impact that has. And it was very impactful for me when you took the time to share the upsetting experiences you'd had. It was very impactful for me to hear that and to be challenged to try to do better. And so I really appreciate that you stuck with us, that you and Megan stuck with us. So
we're happy we've stuck with you too, trust me.
Good. Several of you have spoken about the issues of identity and how people talk about identity, the half-Jew phrase, which is something I never say. I 100% agree with you. The experience you had, Craig, with the rabbi, broaching the idea that your child would need to convert. Daniel, you as well. And I think this does also stem from, as you mentioned, Craig, this ongoing, since 1973, difference in different Jewish movements around the answer to the question of who is a Jew. And sometimes, there is the world as we like to create it at TBI, and the world as we'd like it to be, and the world as it is. And personally, as a rabbi, before I became a rabbi, in rabbinical school, I encountered fellow rabbinical students who had grown up in Reformer Reconstructionist communities and understood themselves to be 100% Jewish, and then as rabbinical students maybe got a job teaching at a conservative religious school and were told, oh, but your mom's not Jewish, so actually you're not Jewish, so you can teach in our religious school, but we can't have you come up for an aliyah and you don't count in a minyan unless you convert. And the outrage and the pain that my colleagues experienced in those moments made me really wonder about the question of, I call it rabbinic malpractice, when we in the more liberal Jewish community don't prepare the students we're raising for the experiences that they may encounter in the Jewish world as it is. So, for example, since being rabbi here, every time I have a child coming for B'nai Mitzvah who's not going to be considered Jewish in some other part of the Jewish world, I try to have a conversation with them where I say, look, in TB, you are 100% Jewish. That's not what this conversation is about. And you should know you're going to encounter in the wider Jewish community people who don't think you're Jewish by their definitions. And it's not because they're bad or mean or trying to be exclusive. It's because different parts of the Jewish community have different definitions of who is a Jew, and the Jewish status that you have that we recognize here isn't the Jewish status that's recognized elsewhere. And if you want to do something about that, if you want to pursue a conversion process, we can, and also you don't have to. Because here within the walls of TBI and in Reconstructionist Judaism, we considered you to be Jewish. And I say all of that sort of also with recognition that that's probably a really uncomfortable conversation too. And so my third question is, there are conversations about identity that we need to have with our children, we need to have as a community, that I think we're failing our children if we don't have those conversations. But do you have thoughts on what are the most responsible, least harmful ways to have those conversations? And that's going to be my last question to this panel, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you.
I think it's the only responsible way to send a kid from an interfaith household out into the world, because at this point here, apparently, the experience that our younger generations are having, I think, is feeling pretty much a part of the community, I think. And I think to send them out into the world being unprepared would be very unethical. And I think that what Craig has described was a very negative experience. Perhaps somebody handling that conversation in a way that was not graceful and compassionate and respectful. From what you've told me, it is a very graceful and compassionate and respectful way that you're doing it, because you're their rabbi. They know that you see them as they are. And I know that I know that that is a conversation that can happen around conversions. I had a beloved family member who handled it very poorly with a friend who had a Reconstructionist conversion. And my beloved family member pointed out that he would not be considered Jewish in Orthodox or conservative circles, and it went badly. So I think it's really the only ethical way to send our children, who are now in a very safe environment, out into a world that is not always going to be hospitable to them.
And I want to make clear, just it's a broader question than just how do I have this particular conversation well, but just do you all have thoughts about best practices around difficult conversations with your children, with our community's children about identity?
Well, I'll just say I completely agree. What was just said about preparation. And I think there's an age consideration too, what's age appropriate. And I don't know, it just seems there's a opportunity for increased engagement with Judaism when you introduce this dilemma, or this very black or white kind of question. So not really much more to add, except I completely understand and respect the conversations that need to happen to prepare. There's this preparation and then engagement. There's an opportunity for increased engagement with these fundamental kind of questions. And yeah, again, just age. I think doing it, with a 5-year-old is different from a 12-year-old, perhaps. And but yeah, there are conversations that need to happen. Add to that.
I'm hoping to hear first from somebody that has older kids than I do.
Yeah, it's tough to be any more constructive than to say that an important part of it is listening. I guess one of my worst nightmares is sit down and talk to my children about an issue or problem, and they don't even recognize that they have one yet, or have one, period. But if there is something that you're trying to deal with, and something that's happened to them, and you want to try to help them work through it, it's really important to listen to see how it has in fact affected them. This is why I prefaced what my personal experience has been, because I have so little real experience with this. My children's identity, strong, hasn't really been challenged. They haven't not ever related experiences like that within this community, for which I'm very grateful. But I do recognize that these things happen, and people get hurt by them or they don't get hurt by them according to what the circumstances are. But one of the reasons we did join the Havurah was to have other parents we could talk to and share experiences with and ideas and suggestions and what works and what doesn't work when these things do come up. And yeah, Christmas was the cliche time, but it's not the only time when interfaith issues arise. Can I say one more thing though about the interfaith? We talk an awful lot, you alluded to this, Rabbi, about the ambiguity of talking about interfaith. We're talking about it from the Jewish perspective. And you know, how do we Jews work through all these issues? On more than one occasion, the Interfaith had on more than one occasion in my participating in the Interfaith Havurah, I had occasion to be reminded that there are two sides to interfaith. And I will tell you quite candidly that more than one non-Jewish partner in that group felt let down by the failure of the group as a whole to identify their concerns and needs as less important than the Jewish ones. So, you know, just throw that out there as another issue that we have to be mindful that.
So even the safe space for interfaith households wound up privileging the common Jewish experience of those interfaith households.
Yeah, exactly.
Forgive me for putting you on the spot. I have an 11-year-old and I have a 6-year-old. And as everybody that has kids, I imagine that's, you know, every kid's different, right? But there's some stuff that's probably universal. I think that from the moment they can start talking and manipulating things around 3 years old, they think that they understand everything. I remember my older one from like 3 to 6 or 7 being that way. My 6-year-old is 100% that way. She thinks she understands everything. She thinks she gets everything. She can do anything. But then what's funny is my 11-year-old's like, oh my God, the world, there is so much to the world. I don't feel that way at all, right? And she'd probably tell you that. And what she actually understands is enormous and blows me away, but she's old enough to recognize that she doesn't understand everything and get everything. What I mean to say by all this, though, is my family's different than anybody else's family, and we talk about difficult conversations. I sometimes think I'm a difficult dad, and so probably my kids think every conversation's a difficult conversation with me. But I try to, and I think I've lived this experience. My kids, if they were here, could tell me if I'm lying. But we try to, everything that, how do I want to put this? We try to give them this kind of information at the maximum of their comprehension, the highest level that they can comprehend. My 11-year-old can comprehend this conversation now about, hey, your mom's not Jewish. There are communities in the United States and in the world, Jewish communities all over the place that aren't necessarily going to accept you as being Jewish. But who cares what they think? It's your life, not theirs. They can go pound sand, right? 6-year-old, that conversation, understanding any of that, right? I mean, she still thinks that the Christmas music that she hears on the radio is just for everybody, including herself, and which it is, right? It is. It's for anybody to listen to, right? But she thinks that has as much to do with what she does on the holidays as anybody else. And so, you know, the dribs and the drabs that you can give her, you know, the other one can almost drink from that proverbial fire hose. I'll get back to you in 25 years if you want to reconvene this and we can see how it went. I don't know, but that's what we're doing.
Great. Well, we have about 20 minutes left, and I'm going to turn it over to the kahal to come up to this microphone, and if many of you want to say something, you could just make a line at the microphone, either to share your own experiences or ask questions. Can you speak closer to the microphone, please? Oh, June is working to get that microphone on. Go ahead. Now just hold it. She turned it on.
Can you? Oh, yeah. Now you can hear me? Oh, yes. Now I can hear myself, too. When I heard about this meeting, it was, just yesterday that because Craig was at Al Havara, and I heard that he was going to be talking about interfaith stuff, and I was surprised. But no, I'm not surprised, having heard the difficulties that people in the panel have had in their lives, and so I wanted to tell a sort of a much happier story. I spent the first 21 years of my life growing up in England. My parents were non-religious, working-class people, lived in a poor working-class neighborhood of London. They felt they had an obligation, though, to send me to Sunday school. And the closest Sunday school was a Methodist church within easy walking distance of our house. And it was that experience, actually, that turned me into an atheist. Well, because, at that Sunday school, well, there was readings from the Gospels, and there was also readings from the books of Moses, of course, right? And it was the books of Moses, the things that God was supposed to have done, that I weren't being explained in a way that a 13-year-old could understand, but they violated the essential Enlightenment values that I had inherited as part of the community. Even at the age of 13, I had those values. So I called myself an agnostic at that point. A few years later, I thought that was dishonest, and I called myself an atheist. And so that's how I was. I immigrated at the age of 21 to the United States, and eventually went to, after 3 years working in Buffalo, finding out what winters are really like, I went to Cornell to get a PhD, and I met my current wife, my only wife. We've been married 57 years, so I doubt whether I'll have a second one. Thank God. At any rate, we met just before class started in 1965, September, and fell in love. We got married in June the next year, 1966. And Annette, my wife, had got a commitment from me that if we got married, the children should be raised as Jews. And I was happy with that. I was an atheist. Why would I? I really didn't care, you see. So we got married. We had 2 children. We have 2 children. And they were raised as Jews. The girl was bat mitzvahed. The boy was bar mitzvahed. And if you go by the matrilineal line, I have 5 grandchildren, all of whom are Jews. But only 2 of the grandchildren are practicing Jews. They went to a private Jewish middle school, which I think really did the works for them. That was a terrific idea of my son and my daughter-in-law to do that. But then, all these experiences that you poor people had, I can't recall any. And I have a very non-Jewish name, Buckmaster. I do recall that when we wanted to name our firstborn, a boy, Simon, we decided to call him Simon Ben David Buckmaster, to send a clue to others that maybe he was a Jew. And I don't think there were no, we've belonged to shuls at various places that we have lived in Connecticut, in Illinois, and we're still members of a shul in Illinois because we maintain a house there. We spent 6 months in Oregon, 6 months in Illinois. And I don't recall ever coming across any nastiness or questioning about our marriage or our children.
I'm so glad, John. Thanks for sharing. I recognize there are 6 people, I think, in line and not so much time left. So I am going to encourage everyone to keep their remarks to 2 minutes if you can. I'll just flash a sign at you when you've been talking for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Rabbi Ruhi. And I do wonder what everyone else will say, and I'm looking forward to hearing you. There's so much. I hope we'll continue having these conversations because there are so many interfaith stories that people, I think, need to release and tell. I moved here to TBI 2 weeks after I converted in Texas, and they told me, we can't convert you, there's no Jews in Oregon. I said, I've looked it up in the Jewish catalog, there are. And I got here, and Ellen Maddox and her father embraced me in my interfaith marriage. And so the ripples keep going out. I joined the Interfaith Havurah, which was 10 years before Craig, and that made a huge difference. We volunteered where TBI and the Congregational Church down the road, or now down the road, used to trade childcare. We would do their childcare for Easter services and Christmas services, and they would do the childcare here for us for high holidays. And so I automatically, immediately knew there's a welcoming here for people who can blend and be bilingual. And when my firstborn, my eldest, came to his time of bar mitzvah, I did not tell him that Rabbi Kinberg had suggested that he go through a conversion. And Rabbi Kinberg was on vacation, so my son went through with alternate rabbis. And he wanted to do his bar mitzvah speech on growing up in an interfaith household, and he was forbidden to do that. He ended up having a generic kind of speech, and after that, he kind of turned away from Judaism because he was shut down. When I remarried, I divorced, the new marriage was to another non-Jew, and the rabbi refused to marry us, and that turned that spouse away from TBI and Judaism until Rabbi Boris came along and invited him in to shake the lulav, and my husband's tears were so deep of being accepted that then our whole family was able to come back to TBI. That's just a few of the stories. Thank you very much for this event. Oh,
Thank you,
and
Lisa.
I have Baptist relatives too.
Hi.
Hi, Nancy.
I don't know if I should be up here, but I am Jewish. I have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who came from the town of Russia, Poland, and assimilation was expected, even though our schools had mostly Jewish and Jewish teachers. But Christmas was what most people did and what we did. I married a Jewish doctor whose experience at bar mitzvah was so awful that he became a committed atheist and would not allow Jewish things with our children. We had Christmas, and I had to make sure that we did Hanukkah with even just little stocking stuffers and lighting the candles. So I was prevented for half a century from experiencing Judaism. I came here as someone who knows no Hebrew, knows prayers, no songs. Well, I know the Shema and the Baruch. So I feel like a guilty Jew who doesn't really belong because I really don't know the steps and what I'm supposed to do. And I feel I've had to reach out and do whatever I can to somehow figure it out on my own. And that's it.
I'm really glad you're here. I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be.
Thank you, Nancy.
I'm Patty Barkin, and the story I wanted to tell is that when I was doing membership work when we had a strong membership outreach community. It was my job back in the 80s and the 90s to welcome new families. And I would make a house visit, and I would welcome them to the Jewish community. And many of those families might have been interfaith or both Jewish. And I remember one story when I asked how you wanted to be listed in the directory. And I was speaking to the Jewish woman and her non-Jewish husband, and I was asking if they wanted both names. She broke out in tears. She was just, oh my God, he can be. And it was because, and yes, so they were both very engaged here for a very long time. But it's interesting tonight to hear the stories about Rabbi Kinberg, because he had already established the Ger Teshav concept when I became involved here. And from the get-go, we always, I felt, welcomed the interfaith families, including putting both names in the directory. For some reason, that felt good to everyone involved. And so I just wanted to tell that story. Then I thought that was how it'd been going on now for 40 years. And so tonight's stories have been interesting.
Thank you, Patty. And to the person who asked about terms on YouTube, so the term that's been referenced a few times, Ger Toshav, literally an other among us, an other dwelling among us, is one term that has been used specifically for as a possibility of how we relate to someone who chooses not to convert, but to make the Jewish community their primary spiritual and social home. But the question on YouTube, is there some term for a non-Jew who is a real friend, supporter / ally? So that's one. But also, if we're not talking about someone who's in a member household, I would just call such a person an ally. Come on up, Cameron.
I guess I'll take this off. Can you hear me okay? The microphone? Okay. So I'm speaking as someone who made a long journey as an ally to Jews for many years. And in the process of that, found out I also had Jewish heritage, not predominant in my family, but there. Ultimately, I converted. So very long journey. I still consider myself an ally because I wasn't raised in this community or this tradition or with this identity, even though there was an influence. And I guess for me, coming from my journey, it's been important to me to be aware of how being raised in the dominant culture or with influences in my family of the dominant culture, I'm going to exude dominant culture and or attitudes or ways of being that can land on people who don't have that, who were raised, strictly as Jews, targeted by anti-Semitism for eons. It can land as anti-Semitism. It can feel that way, can have that impact. And so I guess what I'm also wanting to bring to the conversation is that this is also something that goes in both directions. My understanding is that feelings of questioning one's belonging, feeling like we don't belong, is pretty typical for lots and lots of Jews who are not mixed heritage or interfaith or however. It's part of the legacy that people have internalized. And so there's going to be these feelings coming. Okay, so anyhow, I'm just saying, I want us to be sensitive, those of us who have a mixture or are coming from other traditions, to be sensitive to that some of how we act unawarely might be hard also in that relationship within this community.
Thank you, Cameron. All right, we're going to invite Tom up and then Marcia, and it'll be just about time, so I'm going to close with a few closing reflections after we hear from Tom and Marcia.
Hi, I'm Tom Barkin, and thank you very much for a really informative and delightful program. I wouldn't say delightful, wrong word, but certainly very informative and thought-provoking. What the thought that I came up with is what we're really talking about is what is a Jew, and a subset of that is what is a Jewish family. And when I think of myself as a Jew, what do I have in common with an ultra-Orthodox Jew in Israel that promotes certain sorts of military and political acts but refuses to join the military? And they say that they have a religious reason for doing that. It really makes me think about what is a Jew, and what the conclusion that I came to is if I want to be a Jew and I want to be part of a Jewish community, I have to find a community that has a philosophical bent and a way of looking at the world that's consistent with mine. And that's really the heart of it. And with good fortune, I found that in Eugene, Oregon.
So glad, Tom.
Hi. I was born in Florida, raised Southern Baptist, so I feel your pain. But I figured out when I was 12 that I wasn't a Southern Baptist and started reading everything in my small town library on religion. And when I discovered Judaism, the proverbial light bulb, rainbows, whole thing, I was clearly Jewish, so I went home to the foster home where I was living after my mother died and said, I'm so excited, I'm a Jew. Well, that went over well, yeah. The good news was I didn't have to go to Sunday school anymore. Oh, Sunday school's not good. But I went to the only synagogue in town, to the only rabbi in town. Their entire congregation was maybe 100 people, maybe, counting the ones who never came to service. But the rabbi was very frightened of me because he figured a 12-year-old Goyim girl saying, hi, I'm Jewish, now what, was a trap in some way. But he finally, to get rid of me, he gave me a list of books to read and said, you can come back on Sunday, we'll talk, I'll answer questions. I know what he was thinking now. I didn't when I was 12, which was, she's gonna start the first book and say, what? I don't need this. So from the age of 12 to the age of 18, I studied those books and I had those conversations. And when I was 18, I was converted. And then he told me, please don't come to synagogue, okay? But I did. I just want to say that over the course of my life, I'll be 75 next year, I've been observant, I've been not so observant, I've been to temple, I've been years without temple. I discovered TBI during COVID on YouTube, and I felt it through the TV that this was a community where I could belong, where I would be welcome. But I've got to say, in talking to some of the other converts in this temple, that we feel a lot of what you feel, a lot of what you've described, which is, I converted when I was 18. I'm almost 75. I think I'm a Jew, okay? But there are things that are said that are not intended to make me understand I'm not Jewish enough. But I've had that feeling here. And I love most of the people I've met here. I'm not saying this to be unkind, but converts understand a lot of what you're saying. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I felt like I wanted to tell you that we understand.
Thank you, Marcia. It's one of the least pleasant tasks of the rabbinate to hold boundaries, and that can include the boundary of who is and who is not a Jew. You know, it's telling someone, I'm so glad you're excited about Judaism. You're actually not Jewish, and here is what you would need to do to become Jewish, and that can be a very hard thing for a person to hear. Also the task to say, our time is up, and we need to hold that boundary too. So with true apologies to those who were hurt by me cutting you off, it is one of my least favorite parts of the rabbinate. I do want to close with just a few reflections, which is, I don't know if this is the first time that we've publicly had in the TBI sanctuary a conversation about how TBI does interfaith. But it may be, and that's an amazing thing in and of itself. This community historically has been vital to calling out the reality of interfaith households in the Jewish world, creating a rubric for inclusion, even as we have continued to fumble how we actually do it in the day-to-day, person-to-person reality. And, you know, we've had these various iterations of a whole chavurah that in one generation raised children together. Now we have an interfaith committee that is creating interfaith programming around the holidays. Really, it's a good question. It's not interfaith programming. It's Jewish programming for interfaith people and households. We had, 50 people come to your Hanukkah candle lighting, I think, just last week?
I was at work, unfortunately,
Oh, okay.
but it was much bigger than the year before.
Yeah,
I think
so
that sounds right.
big parties on Sukkot and Hanukkah. And we have lots of interfaith households that don't feel the need to affiliate with an interfaith committee because they're just part of TBI, and that's fine. And it's great if we don't need it. And there's always a growing edge. I think probably when your mother joined the community, Jews who kept kosher felt very welcome here, and Jews who were interfaith probably didn't. Nowadays, Jews who are interfaith, we hope, feel more welcome here, and it's a lot harder for Jews who keep kosher. So I think it's a really interesting question to keep demanding of ourselves that we ask the question, who is this space for? And really live the answer that we want it to be. And if we want it to be that this is a space for all households that are Jewish, want to explore Judaism, have a Jewish member, there is still ongoing work to do, and thank you all for being part of the conversation. So I want to thank our panelists again, Raisa Maddox, Craig Starr, Daniel Hogan, Doug Currier, as well as all of you who shared. And I really very much also, again, want to thank Naama Tubman, who did a lot of work in creating the handouts and helping vision what this conversation was going to be, as well as to our TBI at 90 committee, Gary Tepfer, Ellen Todrus, and Emily Heilbrunn, for putting together this whole string of programming. Our next program of TBI at 90 is going to be on January 21st, telling our story. Thank you all, and have a good evening.